And we'll just wait for people to come in on Zoom. It'll just take a couple of minutes for everybody to come in because it takes, once we start, it takes a couple of moments to appear. Oh, hey, okay, good evening. Welcome everybody to this ASEN discussion on the recent Nations and Nationalism themed section on the lefts and nationalisms in Western Europe. My name's David, I'm the coordinator at ASEN, and I'm delighted to be joined this evening by some fantastic speakers who contributed articles for the theme section. So I have Jacopo Custodi, Tudi Kenaligen, Corey Brown Swan, Enrico Paluan, and Emmanuel Dalimuli. So first off, thank you all very much for joining us. If you are joining us on Zoom, YouTube, Facebook, or through the medium of telepathic communication, if you have any technical problems or anything, do please say in the chat, and we will do our best to get to you as quickly as we can. And if you have any questions as we go through, do please put them in the chat wherever you are, and I will ask them of the panel either as we go through or when we get to the end. Now, somebody was asking me what the theme is for ASEN seminars. The theme is, if I'm honest, things I find interesting is the honest answer. And this one that particularly appealed to me. In some way, I'm English, although I wasn't brought up here, so I've been aware of this sort of whole national question all my life. I'm also, for my sins, a municipal politician, not on a party that, well, on a party that some people would consider on the left, and you can work out for yourselves which party that might be. So this is a particularly interesting one for me. We'll go straight in. I'm going to start by asking Tudi and Emmanuel to briefly present the theme section. What was the genesis of it? How did you begin to put this all together?
Well, I can maybe start talking about the genesis a little bit, and then maybe Tudi can introduce a little bit, present briefly the theme section. So everything started, in fact, at a conference. Tudi and I participated in this conference that was organized at Sciences Po in Paris in 2016 on the same theme of the left and nationalism, in the singular though. Well, we liked it a lot, and then we stayed in touch, and we decided that we wanted to do something about it. So after, I think, a year or two, we decided to try to apply for an ECPR joint session of workshops with a workshop on this theme. And we actually, our proposal was accepted. But then the pandemic came, and so this workshop was postponed twice. We decided to postpone it rather than have it online, and that was also the will of most of the participants. But then in the meantime, we decided that we wanted to do something with this on this subject. So there we started asking around. We talked to some of the people who presented papers at the workshop that that was postponed. We found other authors to try to cover the different range of themes. And then in the end, after a couple of years, more or less, of work, we came up with this theme section that Tudi, I'm sure, is going to describe perfectly.
Yeah, yeah, thank you, Emmanuel, because, well, meanwhile, we presented or we organized our joint session of workshops in Edinburgh last April, but we had started already to work on this theme section. The aim was really to explore this plurality of approaches among left-wing parties, left-wing organizations, left-wing intellectuals on the nation, because I was working on Greens, Emmanuel on Social Democrats, and we realized that the literature was rather poor on this diversity of approaches, because the literature was much more still today focused on Marxists on the nation. So we tried to gather a wide variety of scholars able to present a paper on different aspects of the left. So that's how we got in touch with Jacopo and Enrico, who had presented a paper proposal for the run sessions on left-wing populism. Emmanuel, of course, and Ivan Serrano, who is not here among us today, but who co-wrote his paper with Emmanuel, presented a paper on social democrats on the national issue, but with a double comparison between two parties at two different levels: ERC at the Catalonian level and the PSOE, the Spanish Social Democrats at the Spanish level. We have many other prospects at the very beginning of the special issue or of the same section on anarchists also on the nation or on extreme left parties on the nation, but where we never received the papers that we had planned to receive. And there was my paper, of course, on the Greens on the nation, because there is no literature for the moment on that topic, where also I tried within the paper to have a double comparison with Greens, but in two different states and focusing on two different regions, Brittany in France and Scotland. And finally, we got in touch also with Corey Brown-Swan to have another approach on labor on the nation, likewise with many different focuses, but a strong focus on the issue of Scottish nationalism. So once we gathered all those papers, we submitted it, of course, to Nations and Nationalism, and that's it.
Excellent choice of journal. After you did make me smile, Tudi, saying about the lack of literature on the Greens and nationalism. I had two supervisors from my PhD. Neil Carter, mostly looked at the Greens, but was helping with social movements. The other, Sophia Vassilopoulou, looked at the populism, far right, and so on. And they made the same point. There isn't actually much literature out there at all about Greens and nationalism. There's one for your next theme section. Brilliant, thank you. Let me move on to the sort of the first substantive question, and let's go around and maybe have, we'll go around everybody and see what you think. Does the left have a problem with nationalism or a problem with the nation? Enrico.
Well, I would leave the floor to Jacopo for this more theoretical, perhaps question. I think he could better address this broad, I would say, introductory question. So please, Jacopo.
Jacopo, you've been put in the hot seat.
Yeah, since we wrote the paper together, we split the questions to optimize the time. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for the question, which is like very provocative in a way, but it's a good way to start the discussion. And well, I think that like connections and the relations between left-wing groups, left-wing ideologies, and nationalism do exist, and we know that. This is a matter of fact. It's not really a discussion whether they exist or not, because I mean, historians would agree that do exist. I mean, from the French Revolution onwards, the anti-colonial movements, the peripheral nationalism that Emmanuel will talk about, and the others. So there are connections between left-wing ideologies and nationalism. The question, which is like more interesting, but also more complex in a way, is to understand how and when these connections emerge. And as soon as we start looking at this question, we see that many different types and forms of relations between the left and the nations exist. And in the article that I wrote with Enrico, that we wrote together, we analyzed Podemos and the Five-Star Movement, and especially Podemos, since we stay more on the left side of the ideological spectrum. It's very interesting for this because Podemos is usually treated as a traditional left-wing populist actor, at least in the first years of its existence. But it's also interesting to notice that they used a lot also patriotic rhetoric. And this was something that we tried to explore a little bit more and to understand how and why. And I mean, I will be brief here, maybe we can discuss it later on, but the point was that like Podemos tried to like incorporate a patriotic rhetoric, but mixed with left-wing values and policy proposals. And this was like something that was part of their populist strategy, which characterized the party, at least in the first years of its existence. And like, as I was saying, Podemos is a very interesting case because it shows that relations between left-wing ideology and nationalism, or at least some nationalist elements, do exist, but sometimes they take very specific forms, and that's very different between the cases, because if we compare Podemos with other cases of the left in Europe or even beyond the Europe, we see that like differences emerge in the way they conceive nationality, in the way they express their patriotism, and so on. And this is something that it's really at the heart of like the special issue and of our like academic interest on this topic, I would say.
Fantastic, thank you. I should just say I'm making notes, but if you see me doing that, it's because I've got screens set around me to manage everything. Corey.
Sure, thank you. I think when it comes to the UK, we don't always talk about nationalism. We talk about unionism as the case for state, or British unionism, British nationalism, and sometimes those two concepts become conflated. And so what I've worked to do here is kind of disentangle this and try to understand the Labour Party's struggle. So we've seen the Labour Party struggle electorally. We've also seen it struggle particularly in Scotland, but particularly in England as well, when we think about the collapse of the Red Wall. So we see the struggle to articulate a coherent, a resonant British national identity. And my contribution to this project really began in 2019 as part of an ESRC-funded Between Two Unions project, in which I was basically kind of went around the country talking to Labour politicians, asking them just to articulate their sense of identity, their sense of the union, and their sense of the future of the union. And repeatedly, I was told, well, we're not nationalists. Nationalism is something associated with the Conservatives, English nationalist, a more narrow, a British identity, or with the Scottish nationalists. So they would say, we're not nationalists, we're internationalists, we're not nationalists, we're socialists, we're not nationalists. But at the same time, the party's been pushed to articulate a national identity and has struggled to do so. And I think probably this has kind of historical origins, but I was really interested in kind of the post-devolution period. I think there were probably three main problems for the Labour Party during this period, and the left more generally. I think there was an ambivalence, a deep-seated ambivalence within the mainstream of the party, a reluctance to engage with the national questions facing it. And they really ceded that kind of nationalist ground to Conservatives. They were unwilling to talk about the nation or national identity. Sometimes they used the language of patriotism, but there seemed to be this deep-seated discomfort. It was often very reactive as well. So they were defining their national identity, their nationalism, as unionism sometimes, but really in response or in opposition to Scottish independence. And there was also a tendency to conflate a plurinationalism, so a plurinational UK made up of nations and regions, and a multinational UK, or multicultural UK. So there was a kind of difficult message there. We see Keir Starmer doesn't talk about nationalism. Jeremy Corbyn certainly didn't talk about nationalism. And so often this was delegated to the sub-state nations. It was delegated to certain figures, notably Gordon Brown, to talk about Britishness, to talk about a British identity. But really strong reluctance to engage with the subject. There was an exception, and that was Welsh Labour, which channels and communicates a sense of Welsh national identity alongside a British national identity. And they do so really effectively. But Labour at the centre really continues to struggle to do so.
Thank you. Emmanuel, would you like to come in?
Well, I mean, Jacopo and Corey have said already many things. I would just like to add two general things, since maybe I can provide, and Tudi as well, a more general perspective on the theme section. We started with this idea that there is not a problem, but there is a tension somehow. And I think what Corey said is also quite illustratory of this. That is, many left-wing parties, especially when they are statewide parties, there is a difference for minority parties, for instance, and also it's different for anti-colonial nationalism. But many statewide parties are a little bit reluctant to use this, to engage with, or I mean, it depends. There are of course exceptions, but they are a little bit reluctant, and I think this is because the concept of equality is so central to left-wing traditions that the particularism of nationalism, the nation, makes it difficult to combine, to approach, somehow to address. So this was one of the main, this idea of exploring this tension and the exceptions to the tension, and how, when it comes about, and the strategy to go around it, was a little bit one of the central axis of analysis of the entire theme section. At the same time, as Tudi has already mentioned, this idea of the difference within the left. So precisely, we're talking about left with an S, so in the plural, and there are actually important differences. I think one maybe general, not a rule, but a pattern is that it is easier for parties that claim to belong to the left to use nationalist rhetoric or to deal with the issues related to nationhood when they can portray it as an emancipatory force, when nationalism is a kind of emancipatory force, for instance, in anti-colonial contexts, in minority contexts. In the case of Podemos, I think there is this idea of also that is linked to a kind of populist left-wing tradition. This rhetoric can be used more easily than in other contexts.
So I have to jump in and ask there, and picking up on what you're saying, and Corey, what you're saying about Welsh Labour, does that imply that the Welsh Labour Party is more happy to use a nationalist frame or nationalist rhetoric because it sees itself in some way as anti-colonial, maybe a little bit sort of Tom Nairn in there?
I don't know if it sees itself as anti-colonial. I think it's just really effectively adopted the mantle of Welsh nationalism, of the Welsh language, Welsh cultural identity and civic identity, aided by the fact that it's very comfortably ensconced in power in Wales. So it's seen off the Conservatives, it's seen off Plaid, and so it's been able, its leadership, it's also had that leadership coherence or consistency that Scottish Labour hasn't had, but it feels much more comfortable in a Welsh identity. This might also be in part because they're not reacting to strong demand for Welsh independence. So they can engage a bit more productively, a bit more theoretically with questions over Wales's political future. But there was quite a sharp distinction between Welsh Labour and Scottish Labour, both in kind of talking to people. People were much more willing to talk about their Welsh identity, talk about their identity both as a party and their national identity and identity as Welsh nationalists, in contrast to in Scotland.
Brilliant. Unless anybody else wants to, I don't know if you want to come in on that question, Enrico, but if not, move on to another question. Is there a left-wing nationalism, or are there left-wing nationalisms? Are they, but if there are they banal? Are they hot? Are they something else? Who would like to jump in? Tudi.
Well, globally, in my paper, I've been focusing on Greens and to understand if there is indeed green nationalism or green, as I phrased it, green eco-regionalism. So basically, most Greens would define themselves as anti-nationalists. And indeed, it is not easy nor natural for ecologists to think about the nation. The concepts of national sovereignty and the globality of ecological problems may appear as antinomic. Yet, the Greens, they live also in a world of nations, and they have to have a stance on that topic. And they may also, and this is something more complex, we haven't gone very deep on that topic, but they have also this banal nationalism. So I cannot answer from my research if there is a left-wing nationalism, but Greens have developed a strong stance in favor of cultural diversity, for example, as well as in favor of territorial democracy, which has constructed a few theories how Greens can deal with a national issue, which are bioregionalism, for example, eco-regionalism and eco-nationalism. So Greens do think about the nation, but they don't frame it as a state national issue. They have more used it as multi-level approach about territoriality, about cultural diversity. So they've tried really to not answer this issue of left-wing nationalism, but to say, yes, there is diversity, there is democracy, and how do we deal with it on a territorial level?
I mean, it's interesting because I love you said it, World of Nations. If you roll right down to the bottom of the front page of the ASEN website, it does say we live in a world of nations. And I suppose that's one of the questions here. Is it that left-wing or green groups, parties, are talking about nationalism because nations and nationalisms are ubiquitous, rather than they actually want to talk about it?
Well, when Greens, for example, speak about nationalism, it's to condemn nationalism, is to have a strong stance against nationalism. But at the same time, they have to deal with the reality of nation states, with the reality of cultural diversity, territorialized, and with the reality of the need to territorialize democracy or social issues. So they have to deal with that topic, but they didn't use the words of nationalism to answer that topic. They used the word more of radical democracy, for example, saying that every people has a right to be respected. So they use the phrases also of cultural diversity, saying that all the culture have an equal right to be respected. So, but still doing this, they have to territorialize their political stance. And for example, they have to work at the level at levels already existing. For example, Scotland and Brittany for my research. And in doing this, they reinforce the Scottish or the Breton levels. And in doing this, for example, going up to a claim for Scottish independence, they participate to the nationalist debate, even if they say that they are not doing it on emotional issues. And it's true, they never use historical vocabulary. They have a very instrumental stance, saying that Scotland needs independence if they want to go to implement a green policies, because at the level of the UK, it is impossible because they will never control Westminster, for example. So they need Scottish independence to become European again, or to implement the policies they want to implement.
Enrico, can I pass the question to you?
No, I want to jump in because I think the relationship with the European Union is key to understand how, in our case, frame in a certain sense the theme of nationalism. We analyzed Podemos and the Five Star Movement, who are, to populist parties in Southern Europe and born precisely and categorized as anti-austerity parties. And the use they made of the nationalist frame was very much linked, at least at the beginning, with the rejection of austerity measures, and thus to the reconquering of sovereignty for the people. The important thing to notice here is that in the two parties we analyzed, the nations per se was present in their discourse in two very different sense. In the case of Podemos, and quite I would say in a complementary way with the overall sovereignist discourse of the party in relation to the Europe. Podemos try to mobilize subnational identities or national identities, but not the Spanish one, while at the same time also trying to to give a different meaning of Spanishness, in the sense of a plurinational country, while relying on some banal nationalist discourses and cultural references. In the case of the Five-Star Movement, I would say personally that it is a tricky, it is and it has been a tricky party, in the sense that they never really used the nationalist lexicon, and they tried to escape for a long time any kind of discourse about it. But at the same time, on the one side, they try to present an image of the Italian people which was quite exclusionary, in the sense that they referred to the Italian people mostly as Italian born and let me say Italo-Italian people, so a widening portray of the working class in particular, and also in terms of, for example, of migration policy. They basically had a discourse, proposals that were very much compatible with right-wing exclusionary rhetoric, while at the same time justifying them with legalistic arguments and not with any sort of nativism or I mean the perils that the national identity would have been put through massive immigration. So they used other arguments to justify very much the same proposal. And on the other side, when they adopted the banal nationalist reference, for example, I mean, with some stereotypical portray of Italian people, they described Italian people as familistic, as basically prone to compromise and to break rules, and they present themselves as a way to address this, would say, historic Italian traits in civil society. So their references was much against an idea of any kind of flaunting of some inherent Italian trait in the popular discourse and the popular culture. So and this was in a certain sense effective, because they present themselves as a new party representing honest people against this sort of discourse that they in some sense had to reify and to describe the political class as the representative of the old familistic Italian community.
Jacopo, did you want to come in?
Sorry. Yeah, Enrico already said a lot about our paper. Maybe I could just like broaden the discussion a little bit. And like looking at your question, I mean, looking at the wider European radical left, which is kind of my area of expertise, because like you were saying, is left-wing nationalism banal nationalism? And I was thinking about like other cases within the European radical left, and probably the answer would be, in most cases, yes. And sometimes not even that. I mean, there are some European radical left parties where you struggle to even find traces of banal nationalism. Of course, you do find some of them because it's basically impossible to do politics in like European societies without banal nationalism at all, but it's scarce. Exactly because of this tension that Emmanuel was mentioning before. And yet, still within this very same family of the European radical left, you do find some cases in which not only there is a lot of banal nationalism, but there are even some traces of hot nationalism. And of course, Podemos is like an interesting case, but it's not the only one. Also, Mélenchon has many traces of hot nationalism. But still, just to conclude, it's interesting to notice that even when we do see some traces of hot nationalism, this is not a complete nationalism. Because, for example, to stay on the case of Podemos, you do see hot nationalism at the level of rhetorics, for example. There are some very inflamed discourses of Pablo Iglesias when he really draws a lot from a patriotic rhetoric, and this is very strong, this is not banal. But yet, for example, at the symbolic level, there is no hot nationalism. It's very rare to find in a demonstration of Podemos a national flag, for example, or the use of the national colors, of the national hymns. Those are not common. So even when you do have some elements of hot nationalism, they are like elements, exactly, and not like a complete traditional nationalist, as for the right, for example.
But I mean, I'm just wondering if the thing is, particularly with Podemos and with M5S, they're both parties that are still developing. And I do just wonder if that might change over time.
I would say it has already changed. Like, for example, Podemos is not using so much this type of rhetoric anymore, or at least it's getting rarer and rarer. But it has been very common, I would say, for sure up to 2016, and quite consistently up to 2019. But after that year, it started to disappear. So yes, those parties are definitely changing. And also the Five-Star Movement has been changing in its approach to the nation, especially after reaching institutional positions. Whereas in Podemos, there has been a decrease of patriotic rhetoric. In the Five-Star Movement, there has been an increase, at least after 2018, I would say. Enrico can say it more, but there has been a more common use of some references to national interest, for example, that were not so common in the first narrative of the Five-Star Movement, but became much more common after they reached the governmental position.
I mean, that's interesting straight away that you've got both parties reach institutional power and then start to change, but go in different ways. Sorry, I cut you off, Enrico.
No. Just to add to what Jacopo was saying is that I mean, just as a reflection, but I mean, cultural context matters in the sense that Podemos is, as Jacopo said, I mean, a traditional left-wing populist party, or I would say an archetype of what the left-wing populism is in Europe, and I mean, cultural reference of Podemos, despite I mean, although they try to develop a new identity for the Spanish left, but still is inserted in a very specific cultural environment. While the Five-Star Movement has more, I mean, has more room for maneuver in order to develop their discourse and because it's a new party with a new identity, cross-cutting, at least at the beginning, the left-right dimension. And this allows the party to be, I mean, to change different direction and to take different directions throughout its short history. But the point of national interest, I think, is key to understand what Five Star Movement think and putting in practice when addressing nationalist issues, in the sense that it is a very, I would say, pragmatic way to deal with the topic. Just say we have to represent you as people, and we are committed to do that. So there isn't any sort of internationalist ambition in their discourse. They are just representing Italy abroad when they were in government, and take care of national interests. Of course, I mean, everyone knows how national interest is a rhetoric concept more than a specific content of a political manifesto or a program. But in this way, they could reinforce their post-ideological image also in the realm of international politics, international relations, and the use of nationalism in their rhetoric.
Thank you. I've got a couple more questions that I want to ask quickly. And I've got there's some really interesting questions coming through from the audience as well. So I'll just run through a couple of questions quickly. Corey, when you want me to show that video, do say. So for Emmanuel and Ivan and Tudi, looking at the substate and statewide question, do substate and statewide left-wing parties discuss the issues of nationalism and nationhood differently? Does that affect the discourse?
Sure. I mean, I'll try to be very brief so we have time to see Corey's video, because I'm very excited to see that. Anyways, to be brief, in our paper, Ivan and I tried to look at how two parties that are not often cases that are compared in terms of nationalist rhetoric, so the socialist Spanish party, the PSOE, and Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya, so the Republican left of Catalonia, how they justify national solidarity and their different programs for national solidarity. So basically, Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya wants either a very, very broad autonomy, or at least until recently, or an independent state, and that's the preferred option, especially after 2017. And then a social security that is limited to the residents / citizens of the Catalan state. And on the other side, the Socialist Party, the Spanish Socialist Party, of course, defends the status quo. So you could say that one is a nationalist party, which it actually is, and it is open to say that it is a nationalist party, although a left-wing one that says to pursue an emancipatory project. And the other one is just a social democratic party that defends the current social security system. However, both start from a basic assumption that is, you can read between the lines in all the party statements, that the nation is the community, the main community of people who should, among which redistribution should be prioritized. So we basically used in the conclusion a quote from David Miller, who's a political philosopher, who says basically why it makes sense that, for instance, Swedes redistribute between rich and poor Swedes, and why it wouldn't make more sense that Swedes redistribute with poor people in other countries where the average income is much lower than the average income of poor Swedes. So this idea that, you know, redistribution should be limited around the members, the main community of the nation state, which even if residents are also included, tend to be the citizens of the state, is something that quite naturally, without even needing to explain it, both parties defend, one trying to defend the status quo and the other one trying to defend a change in the status quo. So we tried to explain, to compare these two positions. And of course, the nationalism of Esquerra is much more visible, so it's different in that respect. The one of the PSOE is much more banal, much more under the radar, but the legitimizing principles in terms of redistribution are very, very similar.
Thank you. Tudi, would you like to come in on that at all, or if not?
Yeah, can I'd add a few more words on the topic. Basically, sub-state and statewide left-wing Green parties discuss the issue of nationalism and nationhood in the same manner. There is no ideological difference between Breton Greens and French Greens. Basically, they agree on the topic. But in Brittany or in Scotland, they put much more emphasis on the topics linked to the national issue, and notably to autonomy or independence in the case of Scotland, and cultural diversity, or for example, in Brittany, the co-officiality of the Breton language, which is a Celtic language similar to Welsh. So it's more a difference of emphasis. This issue is very important in Brittany or in Scotland, whereas it's much less important at the level of France, for example, where at the level of France, when they deal with the nation, is mostly to fight against nationalism, but hot right-wing nationalism. But officially, the French Green Party is in favor of federalism, for example, on the right for sub-state people to have their own autonomous institutions, where in Brittany or in Corsica, for example. So this is the official policy of the French Green Party.
Which is quite a change for, for France. You think of France, any sort of variation from, from fairly,
the French Green Party is very different from all other main parties in France on that topic of internal diversity.
Yeah. Although I will note that the French Eurovision entry this year was sung in Breton.
Yes, for the second time, yes, indeed.
Second time, yeah. Sorry, you can probably tell my slight obsession with Eurovision. Okay, I'm going to move on to questions from the audience in a moment if I can. Corey, shall I play the video now? Would that make sense? Okay, bear with me. I'm going to try to make this work. Zoom has not been cooperating today.
I mean, even the first 30 seconds, or I can do a bit of a voiceover. I saw it this week and thought it was fascinating. I'm happy to talk through why it was quite so fascinating. But
so hopefully everybody can see the video now on screen. I'm going to play it. It's a video from Richard Leonard, who's a member of the Scottish Parliament and former leader of the Scottish Labour Party.
No narrow nationalism can satisfy our people. The world is my country. The declaration of every socialist.
Yeah, it just has music rather than a voiceover, and maybe just the first few seconds of it. And I'm happy to talk about why I found it quite so fascinating.
Please.
That's helpful. This was kind of Richard Leonard's no longer a leader of the Scottish Labour Party. He was very closely allied with Corbyn, and that was viewed as a bit of a political liability in Scotland. But I found this video that he tweeted this week so emblematic of that tension within the Labour Party over articulating a sense of nationalism. And this kind of, there's a song that plays in the background of no narrow nationalism will satisfy our people, with these images of Brazilian democracy movements, Black Lives Matter, climate change, Indigenous movements. And it was interesting to see an explicit rejection of both a British and Scottish nationalism in favor of a more movement-oriented, perhaps more radical, more left-wing national identity, which is, I don't know, I was convinced it was a subtweet of the kind of work that's been done this week from Labour, the announcements this week from Labour on from Gordon Brown and from on that constitutional review. But this was I think probably a representation of a tension or different dynamics within the Labour Party. It was an attempt to articulate an international identity instead of a nationalist identity. So I don't know, I found it quite fascinating and perhaps representative of some of these issues we were talking about.
Yeah. No, absolutely. No, it was. It's. I know. There's. I saw you tweeted it out earlier in the week, and I remember watching it. I thought, yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. It does capture those issues.
Yeah.
I've got a question from Jonathan Hearn, and I'm not just asking this because he's my boss. Is part of the success of Brexit in the referendum due to an emancipatory appeal to an English working class, i.e. emancipations from the EU? There are both left and right cases for Brexit. And I'll throw that open to everybody, but I'm guessing this is more your area, Corey.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was that kind of left-wing case for Brexit. There was that the appeal made to traditional Labour supporters, traditional members of the working class, or those who felt a strong working class identity, against an elite, against a remote elite, those in Brussels who were imposing certain values, despite some of those values or policies, EU policies being quite left-wing in terms of European Working Time Directive, certain social rights and things like that. So I definitely think we saw, I think the most salient case for Brexit made in the media, made in that political sphere, was a right-wing one. But there was a left-wing case for Brexit made, which did appeal to those English working class voters who felt like the existing system wasn't serving them, whether that was a Westminster system or a European system.
And I don't know, it's just interesting to the fallout of that is continuing today. You know, in all the discussions we're having, and Labour trying to work out what its position is on Brexit now. And I think it's one that's going to be with us for a long time. Did anybody else want to jump in on that?
Yeah,
Emmanuel.
if I may, because I mentioned a couple of times before this idea of, you know, if left-wing parties manage to portray, to convey their nationalism as an emancipatory force, somehow it works better, it's easier. And of course, there is nothing that is intrinsically emancipatory. I mean, it's a matter of, you know, different perceptions and how you use, you convince your audience that you are conveying an emancipatory project. So, of course, this emancipatory language, and we can put it in inverted commas, if we want, can be used by other actors as well, sometimes with very similar arguments, sometimes with different arguments, but of course, it's not something that is just a reserve of, you know, it's just reserved to left-wing parties.
And of course, you know, when you think about it, the slogan, sorry, going back to Brexit, the slogan, "Take back control." I mean, that's powerful straight away, and it captures that, I think, you know, for good or for ill. Unless anybody else wanted to come in on that, I've got another question on the relation of democratic movements, nationalism, and the co-opting of populism by governmental bodies, and I think possibly going back to we were talking earlier on about M5S and Podemos, how they changed in response to power. Is there a risk that these movements, or how do movements like this, left-wing movements, which perhaps have a national frame, change in response to achieving power, if at all? And I'll throw that open to everybody. Enrico.
Well, I'll deal the case of the Five Star Movement. and again, the way they changed was on the one side was perhaps in line with what much literature on populism and populism in power alerts, in the sense that the so-called moderating thesis. When they come to the government, they tend to moderate their rhetoric and to assume a more responsible instead of a responsive stance. But this is true in the sense that the Festa movement, for instance, in 2014 and 15, campaigned for a sort of Italexit, in the sense that they aim to quitting the Eurozone and to call for a popular referendum on it, while this aspect was completely banned in the very previous years of the 2018 election, when they won by landslide and assume governmental responsibilities. But still, in the first government they formed with the far-right League, they still used a very confrontative stance with the European Union, both on migratory policies and particularly in the case of the Festa movement on budgetary issues. And they, it has been described, this kind of stance as provocative, but at the end ineffective claim of sovereignty, in the sense that they had to moderate in any case their goals, while at the same time emphasizing that a government looking for Italian interest was able to get more money, basically, from the EU, and so to better represent the interest of Italian citizens through a strong stance. The point is that when they formed other governments with left-wing forces or center-left parties, well, the pandemic occurred, and at the same time, their government, the Festa movement government, claimed for new European programs, and the Next Generation EU was, of course, a strong reply for the pandemic emergency, and they could celebrate again this kind of program as a success of a strong Italian position in the European Union. So again, I think they have, in this sense, quite a stable attitude in terms of communitarian relations and policies, and at the same time, again, a very compatible stance with their post-ideological image as purely populist, basically. So basically devoted to representing the interests of the people. Is not only a matter of taking back control, like in the case of Brexit, but of being a sort of representative of Italian people in international fora. And well, the nickname of this, the nickname that the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister and now President of the Festa movement, Giuseppe Conte, was the lawyer of the people, and he acted in this way in international fora by using nationalist references to do that, but again, in a very, I would say, pragmatic term, to basically counteract and the supposed previous position of Italian government that they were mocked and attacked for their excessive compliance with the EU directive. So this was the way they acted, And again, I think it was very, very coherent with the image that they wanted to build around their party throughout their entire history.
Did anybody else want to come in on that question? If not, I have a question from friend of ASEN, Danny Cetra. A key paradox, it seems to me, Danny, is that mainstream leftist forces avoid the explicit vocabulary of nationalism while operating quite comfortably within national borders, national political systems, and advocating policies designed for the nation. My question is this: is this simply a matter of nationalism being a nasty word since World War II? Or is this yet another instance of banal nationalism? Or perhaps more interestingly, does this paradox suggest something deeper about the difficulty to reconcile conceptually two ideologies that in practice coexist? Emmanuel, I see you smiling. Did you want to jump in?
Yes, but I have to ask you if you can repeat the premise, because I lost the connection in that moment. So I heard the very easy question, and I'm of course being sarcastic that Danny just asked. Thank you, Danny. But if you can just repeat the premise, because I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
I'll post it in the chat as well. But the question is, a key paradox, it seems to me, is that mainstream leftist forces avoid the explicit vocabulary of nationalism while operating quite comfortably within national borders, national political systems, and advocating policies designed for the nation. My question is this simply a matter of nationalism being a nasty word since World War II? Or is this yet another instance of banal nationalism? Or perhaps more interestingly, does this paradox suggest something deeper about the difficulty to reconcile conceptually two ideologies that in practice coexist?
I can say I see Corey also seems to be willing. So I'll leave Corey first, and then I'll say something.
Sorry, no. Yeah, I think very rarely does a state nationalist describe themselves as nationalists. They seem allergic to that language. They might talk about patriotism, but they often kind of decry the language of nationalism. I mean, there's that the cartoon of the Spanish nationalist wrapped in a Spanish flag, pointing at the Basques and the Catalans, saying nationalistas and nationalists, which I think could probably be interpreted across all contexts where there's territorial contestation. I do find it interesting the kind of denial of nationalism, or kind of obscuring nationalism, particularly on the left. But I wonder if some of that's more recent, and those of you who work on populism could probably speak to this in more detail. But is there something, when we talk about the rise of global nationalism, is the idea of a national identity, is the idea of a nationalist outlook tainted by the rise of kind of far right nationalism? But I found it in interviews, and none of my interviewees would ever admit or would ever claim any sort of nationalism, and they would often explicitly deny being a British nationalist, because British nationalism to them was something, was the BNP, was the EDL, was this far right ideology, which was anathema to a Labour ideology, and I think that speaks to their understanding of it, but also the challenge that left-wing parties have articulating a national identity, articulating a case for state integrity, or a case for the state in areas of contestation. But I'll hand that over to Emmanuel.
Sorry.
Can I say, please?
No, go ahead, Enrico. Go ahead.
No, just I mean, very rapidly. I love the question. I was thinking, I mean, I conducted quite a lot of research in Latin America, and when, I mean, the question is very much, I would say, I mean, evidently centered on the European situation, while I would say in Latin America this kind of paradox is completely absent, in the sense that historically was the mainstream leftist forces were those who adopted not exclusively, but it was quite a general stance, a nationalist rhetoric, with I mean, the elephant of the room, which was imperialism in the US. And I think in the European case, perhaps the last really mainstream forces from the left that adopted a nationalist rhetoric consistently was the PASOK in the 80s. So this is I mean a key aspect to be aware of, and I feel that again, from Latin America, you can see now that in two countries at least, Chile and Brazil, coexist a traditional left-wing nationalist register, and now also a very strong nationalist rhetoric from the right, which is very similar to the European one that you can find easily in most European countries, and that appeal to a Creole nationalism that is directed against, for example, indigenous minority or migrating people. So I think it's a question that should be perhaps answered in a more general way by looking in different areas how concretely the mainstream left dealt with the nation and the frame they used to deal with the topic. So sorry, Emmanuel.
No worries. Thanks for sharing these comments. What I just wanted to add is that, and I think your question, or actually Danny's question, touches upon a very important definitional issue. So what is nationalism? And well, I think Jacopo also probably has a couple of things to say about this, because he just had an exchange on this topic with other authors on nations and nationalism. But especially in political science, there is a tendency to talk about nationalism or nationalist parties as these extreme parties that, you know, defend national interest in extreme forms, that are in favor of exclusionary policies, that are in favor of protectionism, this kind of phenomenon. And actually, within nationalism studies, it is pretty well known that it is a much broader phenomenon, and both these what they have in common, this broader definition and the extreme one, is that, you know, this idea of rule by the people, like, you know, the political and the community and the national community should be congruent. The government should be of the people, by the people, for the people. So you then can have let's say baseline interpretation of this principle, that is what most of us share, and probably most of the left also, or left-wing parties accept and play within this framework, which is a nationalist framework in historical perspective, but we have forgotten the perception that it is. And then there are those who take this framework and, you know, keep talking about the fact that this rule by the people is violated. There are external forces that somehow infringe upon the sovereignty of the nation, and so on and so forth. So in this theme section, precisely because we wanted to look at how the left deal with this baseline nationalism, we broaden a little bit the definition. I'm not saying that it is not useful to have a more parsimonious definition. I think in many ways, in many types of analysis, is very useful precisely to distinguish between different intensities. But we wanted to broaden it precisely because it was instrumental to go and look deeper into how this baseline nationalism affects the left, either because it accepts it sometimes mindlessly, or because it plays with it, or in any case, it plays within the framework of this baseline nationalism.
Yeah, we've only got a few minutes left, so we probably don't have time to quite do the whole "what is a nation" question. But Jacopo.
Yeah, if I can just jump in very briefly on this, I fully agree with everything Emmanuel said. If I could just add that I think we should keep in mind that nationalism as a concept is both a category of practice and a category of analysis. And I mean, this implies that it is used with different meaning in different ways. Like, for example, I have no problem in writing an academic paper saying the nationalist rhetoric of Pablo Iglesias, but I would never write a journalistic article calling Podemos a nationalist party. That makes no sense. So of course, we should bear in mind like which type of language are we using, the public we are talking to, because nationalism as a category of analysis in the way that Emmanuel perfectly explained is one thing, but nationalism as a category of practice that we hear every day in the media, in the newspaper, and that we discuss with people, it's a bit different, no? So this is something that we should deal with, and we cannot just ignore.
Fantastic. So we're running up against the end, so I'm going to go around and offer everybody a sort of last word, if I may. But we've also had a question actually referring to a party in Taiwan. But in your sort of last word, if I could ask you to deal with one difficult question and one easy question. The easy question is, how can this be generalized? Does this generalize beyond Europe? Enrico, you're talking about Brazil and Chile, but can this be generalized to other parts of the world? And then the difficult question, seeing as we're talking about national contestation, who is going to win the World Cup? I don't know who would like to go first. Or Jacopo, we were with you. Let's start with you again.
No, I think the others can go. I just talked. So.
Oh, okay. Corey?
I think we can generalize beyond Europe. I think we should. I think especially working on sub-state and state nationalism in decentralized contexts or secessionist contexts, I think there's a tendency to revert to the usual suspects, and I'm guilty of it as well, working on the UK and Belgium. But I think we should be looking more broadly. I think we need to, as a field, think about how we're understanding things in comparative perspective, looking at and kind of challenging ourselves and challenging our colleagues to look beyond the usual suspects to create a more holistic understanding of phenomenons, but also just avoid that kind of Eurocentric academic perspective.
We're just going to go around clockwise on my screen. 2D.
Likewise, my focus was really on Western Europe, and all my research has been dealing with Europe. But as far as I see, well, we focus on Western Europe because all the cases are comparable and are linked because they belong to the same history and to the same cognitive space. But yeah, with Emmanuel, we would like to go beyond Europe also, and to compare left-wing and nationalism in other instances. And for example, in Latin America, there is already quite a lot of literature on nationalism in left-wing parties in South America, for example, where some cognitive barriers that you find in Europe against nationalism are not that present because their history is radically different. And left-wing parties in South America tend to use their language of the nation in a much more open or even hot manner. So this is something that must be compared also and go beyond this Western Europe focus.
Thank you. Jacopo.
Yeah, very interesting and very difficult question. Also because I think like scholars of nationalism tried for a century to generalize a definition of the nation, no? To find a definition or a concept that could be like generalizable and used in different contexts and in different times. And of course, it's extremely difficult. And that's why I think like the concept of Anderson, of imaging communities, became so popular, because in a way it escapes this problem, no? And I think this problem is still here. And we have it also when we study like nationalist politics in an empirical way, without having like the aspiration of finding new like theoretical definition. But even in empirical analysis, we do have this problem of generalization of nationalist politics. But I think we just have to deal with that. And it's an essential part of nationalist politics, the fact that it appears in very different ways in different times and in different spaces.
Absolutely. Emmanuel.
So I'll start with the difficult question. I would say Argentina.
Correct answer.
And then with the easy question, I think we should definitely expand beyond Europe. The reason why we chose to work on, and also we chose to work on mostly on Western Europe, not Eastern Europe, is a little bit for our expertise. So we didn't want to venture and say things on parts of the world we don't know well, and also because, as Tudi said, there is quite a lot of literature on the left and nationalism in Latin America, especially through the framework of populism. There is quite a lot of literature on nationalism and anti-colonial movements, so at least in historical perspective. So we found a kind of niche in contemporary Western Europe in which we think we could make a contribution. But as Tudi said, we also have ideas to maybe expand further. And I think it's something we should definitely do comparatively.
Fantastic. Enrico, I think the last word is yours.
No, yeah, just a little bit argue about the necessity of broadening our view, but I mean, again, I would say that in this sense, literature on populism has already developed. I mean, many of the question, in the sense that the concept of the nation and the concept of the people are both a relational concept and antagonistic concept, and so any comparison should first of all address what is the antagonist of a specific concept of people in the case of populism, or nation in the case of nationalism, and then to understand the way it can be inclusionary or exclusionary, the target that implicitly or explicitly a nationalist rhetoric has, and this, I mean, this relation, inner relational understanding is I would say that the biggest paradox, the biggest problem to undertake a comparative perspective. And on the difficult question, I have occasionally the wall of the flag that is I think that the team will win the World Cup.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much. This has been absolutely fascinating. The articles are, of course, available on the Nations and Nationalism website. If you just Google Nations and Nationalism, it will come up on Wiley or available in the journal. So one quick announcement, which is that applications are open for our second annual summer school in Zadar in Croatia. If you're interested in that, if you just go to asen.ac.uk/summer school, speakers at the summer school include Sasha Bojic, Miguel Centeno, Leah David, John Fox, Daphne Halikiopoulos, Jonathan Hearn, Deborah Capel, Ellie Knott, Gizim Kresniki, Simona Kuti, Sinisha Malashevich, and Gordana Uzelac. I think with that, the only thing left for me to do is to thank our speakers, Corey Brown-Swan, Enrico Paduan, Emmanuel Dalimule, Jacopo Custodi, and Tudi Cardinal again. And on behalf of ASEN, to wish you all, wherever you are in the world, a peaceful Christmas and a prosperous New Year. I see Emmanuel wants to jump in.
Can I just add one thing? The articles, if I'm not wrong, should be most of them open access.
Yes,
so
yes,
it's an important
yes, they
thing
are.
for all those who have issues with accessing papers. This one, most, or at least most, or all, should be open access.
I think they are all. I think they're all open access. But yeah, if you look for them, and they're linked from the ASEN website and from our socials as well. Brilliant. Thank you all very much. Take care, and we'll see you in the new year. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
It was a
you very
pleasure.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Recording stopped.